driving into Kilsyth, it's quite easy to miss this otherwise quite conspicuous building in the graveyard on the left. If you're familiar with Scottish graveyards, then you'll recognise this little building as a watchtower. These booths were built in the early 19th century to accommodate night watchmen who kept an eye out for body snatchers, people who came under cover of darkness to dig up the newly buried corpses in order to sell them to medical schools for dissection. But that's another story. It isn't that aspect of this little building which is of interest to us for now. Unusually, this watchtower itself conceals a body, the body of a woman and her child. The story of that woman, Jean Cochrane, and the personal tensions which bore down upon her is in many ways a narrative in miniature of the religious and political tensions which racked the whole of Scotland in the 17th century. This is the story of a noble woman and two noble men, to both of whom she was wife at different times. It's a story of royalists and Covenanters and the changing fortunes of both. It's a story of persecution and betrayal, but also of deep love and great loyalty. A story of a silver bullet and a rumoured pact with the devil. A story of romance interrupted by tragedy and rekindled in a different form, then triumphing over another deep loss. Of betrothal rings lost and then found, long after their owners had passed away. Of a body embalmed and a century later declared by those who saw it to be as if the person had only just died. A story which deserves to be told. Jean was born into a Protestant noble family here in Paisley, but she married the man considered most responsible for the persecution, imprisonment and even execution of Protestant Covenanters. That man was John Graham, Laird of Claverhouse, 1st Viscount Dundee. Considering that Jean's family tended to the Covenanting side and that her mother looked on Claverhouse as pretty much the devil incarnate, how did this union ever take place? And how is it that the wife of Claverhouse, Bonnie Dundee, the victor of the Battle of Killiecrankie in 1689, lies buried here in Kilsyth rather than in Dundee or even in Paisley? And how was it that she died in Holland? And why, if she died in Holland, was her body brought back to Scotland? And why is she buried under a watchtower? Jean Cochrane had a fairly normal childhood of a well-to-do family of the time. Born in 1662 in this building attached to Paisley Abbey, a house known at the time as the Place of Paisley, her father William Cochrane died in 1679 when she was 17, and thereafter she was in the care of her grandfather, also William Cochrane, 1st Earl of Dundonald. It has often been said that the elder William Cochrane was a Covenanter, albeit one with a broad outlook. However, the few details we have of his life suggest his allegiance was elsewhere. When the National Covenant was drawn up in 1638, Cochrane was a signatory, but during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms in the 1640s, he supported the Royalist side. And then, when the parliamentarians in London eventually prevailed and took control of England, Ireland and Scotland, Cochrane was given a heavy fine for his opposition.
After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, his fortunes changed. He was appointed a member of the Scottish Privy Council, and in 1669 King Charles II gave him the title Earl of Dundonald, Lord Cochrane of Paisley and Ochiltree. Despite these establishment credentials, the highly partisan nature of the politics of the day meant that his broad outlook and tolerant nature landed him under the suspicion of the dominant powers of his time. For example, he had accepted his oldest son, also William, marrying into a staunchly Covenanting family, and then when that son was bedridden with an illness, which eventually took his life, the Earl turned a blind eye as his Covenanting daughter-in-law secretly brought in a non-conformist chaplain to pray for her husband. Worse still, his second son John was suspected of having taken part in a conspiracy in England known as the Rye House Plot, a thwarted plan to ambush and assassinate the King, Charles II, for which reason Cochrane Jr. had to flee the country and spend time in exile in Holland.
These suspicions were not, however, enough to deter a certain Royalist army captain from being a frequent visitor to the Earl of Dundonald's household.
John Graham, Laird of Claverhouse, had made a name for himself as an ardent suppressor of the people the government referred to as wild fanatics and rebels, but who saw themselves as simply ordinary men and women who were trying to lead a Christian life according to their own consciences, rather than by outwardly conforming to the detested religious formulae set out by the king and state. Being continually harassed by government troops, they eventually felt the need to take up arms for self-protection, but this caused further difficulties for themselves as they were now seen as dangerous insurrectionists. The Laird of Claverhouse, captain of a troop of horse guards charged with protecting the realm from those considered insurgents, was stationed in the southwest of Scotland and regularly passed by Paisley. In his personal life, he'd been for some years in matrimonial negotiations with the family of a young heiress, Helen Graham, a distant relative. This was an affair more economic than of the heart, as he never actually saw the young lady in question, but communicated with the uncle from whom she was to inherit a considerable estate. Ultimately, Helen accepted another suitor, leaving John Graham of Claverhouse with nothing to show for his years of trouble. By 1684 he was in his late 30s and, typical of the upper classes of his day, anxious to have an heir to the estates he already possessed. And perhaps he had also begun to feel that a conjugal relationship should be more than a mere functional alliance between families. The granddaughter of the Earl of Dundonald, whom he had scarcely noticed during his pursuit of Helen Graham, began to catch his eye. Jean was now in her early 20s and, by all accounts, a great beauty. Lines written by an admirer spoke of her thus: "She, while she lived, each woman did excel in everything which we perfection call. It seems the gods designed her outward form, their masterpiece and standard uniform." Claverhouse began to consider Jean as a suitable match, and as a mother for his desired heir. But this time he didn't only deal with her legal guardian, the Earl of Dundonald, but also directly with the young lady herself. He found a woman who, in addition to that divine outward form, was spirited and energetic, and also possessed of an independent and practical mind. In the words of one of Claverhouse's biographers, "Lacking other evidence, her character is best discerned in the fact that she was Claverhouse's wife. One cannot imagine him married to a nursery miss."
The Honourable Jean Cochrane and Colonel John Graham, Laird of Claverhouse, were married on Tuesday, the 9th of June 1684, here in the St Mirren Chapel of Paisley Abbey. It was a grand event for the town, an excuse for feasting and revelry, but for Jean there were two flies in the ointment which robbed her of much of the joy of the day.
Firstly, her mother, the widowed Lady Catherine Cochrane, had withheld her blessing from the union from the outset, and now refused to attend the wedding. Her signature is conspicuously absent from the marriage contract. Lady Cochrane's sympathies lay squarely with the Covenanters, whom she considered innocent seekers after God, and she was appalled at her daughter's acceptance of marriage from this man whom she looked on as pretty much the devil incarnate.
Secondly, something happened which was like the fulfilment of a prophecy which Jean's mother might have made regarding the disruption to married life and the moral dilemmas which Jean would have to live with as wife of the so-called bloody Clavers. After the ceremony, when the bridal couple and all the guests were seated for the marriage feast, an urgent note was brought to the bridegroom. Intelligence of a gathering of Covenanters had come, and Jean's new husband, Colonel Claverhouse, commander of His Majesty's Regiment of Horse, was obliged to depart immediately to break it up. As he hurriedly left the celebration, he was heard to say they might have let Tuesday pass, meaning that the Covenanters ought to have been more considerate and not have given him work on his wedding day. But more annoying to Clavers was that these inconsiderate Covenanters also had received intelligence regarding the coming of His Majesty's Regiment of Horse, and so he and his troops spent 3 fruitless days searching for an elusive quarry, finally returning to Paisley empty-handed.
Claverhouse's marriage with the daughter of a family sympathetic to the rebels was used against him by rivals in Edinburgh, competing for the king's attention in his distribution of titles of nobility and army positions. They whispered to the king that, having married in my lord Dundonald's fanatic family, it was not safe to commit the king's secrets to Claverhouse. The Laird of Claverhouse, however, also had the king's ear, with the result that, rather than being demoted and disgraced, the king elevated him even further. In 1688, the Laird of Claverhouse was given the title Viscount Dundee, making Jean Viscountess or Lady Dundee. They took up residence in Dundee in Durham Castle. To crown their glories, in February 1689 a boy was born to the newly ennobled couple, providing Claverhouse with the heir he so desired.
But the Viscount and Viscountess were not to enjoy these blessings for long. Momentous circumstances are about to engulf them. Over the next few months, Viscount Dundee found himself on the wrong side of history in tumultuous events which we can only briefly touch on in this short account. The British government, angered by the determinedly Catholic leanings of the new King James II, stood against the monarch and invited the Dutch Protestant Prince William of Orange, King James's nephew, to come to Britain and rule in his place. Viscount Dundee, unable to accept the overthrow of the monarchy he had spent his life fighting for, went from being the hunter to the hunted and had to go underground. Believing strongly in his cause, he set about raising an army amongst the Highlanders, who strongly supported King James, and led them in fighting against the new state, which he considered illegitimate. On the 27th of July 1689, tired of being hounded, he took the offensive and led his soldiers in an attack on the pursuing government army at the pass of Killiecrankie. Using the age-old, primitive but highly effective Highlanders' strategy of charging from a height, his troops succeeded in breaking the enemy's ranks, causing panic and confusion. It was a rout. Although he had won a great victory, Viscount Dundee himself suffered a mortal wound when a stray bullet found him, and he died here before knowing the outcome of the battle. His soldiers had proven themselves, but they knew that the forces against them were much stronger than they were, and now their leader, the man who had welded them into a fighting force, was gone. Without any opportunity to give their commander the send-off they felt he merited, they gathered up his body and brought him quietly here to this little chapel near Blair Castle and buried him, where his body remains to this day.
Jean, Viscountess Dundee, found herself bereft of her husband, but she still had her baby boy James, now second Viscount Dundee. However, before the year was out, she had also lost her son, carried off by a sudden illness. There were those who claimed that Jean's personal tragedies were divine punishment for her great sin of marrying the chief persecutor of the people of God. And so it was a great mercy to Jean that her own mother now received her with compassion and understanding in her deep mourning. Elsewhere, Jean, as widow of such a high standing and famous public figure, was subjected to constant obloquy wherever she went, which made her already miserable state quite intolerable. She considered voluntary exile in Holland, where she had a relative.